Our car is presented mainly with petrol engines M270 and the related AMG M133, as well as diesel OM651, that is, everything is the same as in the A-Class. The nuances here are, in general, the same: dense layout, high temperature, weak expansion tank, intense work of radiator fans, and the presence of several electric pumps at once, on which the health of the engine and gearbox depends. In general, the system is complex and requires regular and high-quality maintenance. The M270 line is discussed in detail in the A-Class review, so we will focus on clarifying the data on the service life and prices for restoring a number of units. The service life of the chains is definitely at least hundreds of thousands. Often on cars with 150,000 kilometers on the odometer, there are also no signs of wear or replacement. But with mileage, errors in the displacement of phase-setting masks on the shafts become more and more common, which happens even in cars of late production. The issue can be radically solved by spot welding. Many services have acquired it. Fortunately, a tool for welding lithium-ion batteries is sold on a Chinese aggregator for pennies. The stoppers on phase regulators break. The design has been modified several times, and whether the latest versions of the engines have this problem is not yet clear. Many owners put up with a characteristic crackling noise when starting up due to the high cost of replacing phase regulators, well over 100,000 rubles. It is difficult to say yet whether there are any more serious consequences other than the crash. Hey buddy, looking for a used car? You should pay attention to the site Carmi.pro. Carmi.pro is huge catalog of cars, engines, gearboxes, and the best part is, you can find out about breakdowns of any part of any car, absolutely free. Go on Carmi.pro and be aware of all possible malfunctions. Carmi.pro. Leaks of gasoline from the injection hose and antifreeze leaks from the pipe to the turbine are regularly encountered. In the latter case, the pipe does not require replacement, the sealing rings are replaced. And the nozzles on the injection pump are most often replaced with a simple MBS sleeve, since the original ones are 2 orders of magnitude more expensive. The headache with thermostat life has become less acute with the advent of non-original options of acceptable quality for about 6,000 rubles. They are definitely enough for 30 kilometers, and this is exactly the resource of the original thermostat of the second revision. The crankcase ventilation system requires regular attention at the first signs of oiling, otherwise the engine may not survive the frosty winter. If the tubes of the crankcase ventilation valve are clogged, then in winter they will freeze and the oil will be squeezed out and you can even lose the engine. The price of the original oil separator and tube with valve is now 15 to 13,000 rubles. A large tube without a valve costs about 20,000, but membrane repair kits are available for sale for 1,700 rubles. Many services began to clean the large pipe and install a fluoroplastic corrugated hose instead of the worn-out original one. Diesel GLAs are extremely unpopular, and collecting statistics is problematic, but there are almost certainly no differences in operation from the same engines in the A-Class. For the OM651, the main risk factor is the oil pump and the oil supply valve to the injectors. If you put a plug on the oil pump control valve, the likelihood of trouble will be minimal. Even low-power versions of the GLA get solid brakes. There are discs with a diameter of 295/305 mm at the front and 295 mm at the rear. Options with all-wheel drive already have 320 mm front discs, and on the GLA 45 AMG they are even 350 mm in diameter. The calipers are single piston with a floating caliper and are very reliable. At the rear, the parking brake mechanism is implemented with separate geared motors on calipers and is also quite reliable. In terms of prices, these components are not much different from what is offered. For example, for Volkswagen, around 5,000 rubles for a non-original gearbox and 25,000 for a part with a Mercedes brand. In general, there are no problems with the brakes, but the owners still constantly discuss this topic. Conversations about installing AMG brakes are heard regularly in the Mercedes-Benz Club. High prices for original spare parts do not particularly frighten any of the brand owners, purists buy only the original, and for those who do not mind consumables from other brands, There are a lot of very inexpensive substitutes. The chassis is structurally similar to that installed on the A-Class W176, but the GLA has its own suspension travel and element stiffness. The resource also differs, and not for the better. This can be partly explained by the fact that in the GLA you don't have to sneak at 20 kilometers per hour on rough roads. You can drive all the money without fear of being left without bumpers. But at the same time, an increase in the working stroke of the suspensions affects it, which means that the load on the silent blocks increases. In the front suspension, the main consumable elements are the stabilizer struts and the rear silent block of the lever. Racks are essentially consumables with a service life of up to 40 to 50,000, and the silent block lasts up to a mileage of 80 to 100,000. With careful operation, the suspension may not require any repairs up to 200,000, but in our conditions this is unlikely. A silent block costs about 8,000 rubles for the original, and a replacement can be found for 1,000 rubles. True, this will be an insert with an obviously shorter resource, and its installation will also affect driving comfort. A full-size silent block, which comes complete with a bracket, will cost more than 3,000. The ball is not replaceable, but if the boot is intact, it lasts more than 200,000. The wheel bearing is replaced separately and is relatively inexpensive, from 5,000 for a part of a decent brand. The strut supports can be considered eternal, but the subframe supports hold up worse, and sometimes the bolts of its fastenings become loose. The rear suspension is more durable than the front, although there are a lot of levers, and if repairs happen, it will cost a pretty penny. The weak point here is the shock absorbers. Their boots often knock and their service life quickly runs out, and then the car begins to sway. The main consumables in the rear suspension are 3 wishbone silent blocks on the outside, on each side. The price of the original is low, 1.5 to 2,000 rubles each. If the springs sag or are installed incorrectly, the butterfly silent block on the trailing arm also fails. In the original it is not supplied separately, but non-original ones are available for sale. In most cases, the suspension requires repairs after a mileage of 150,000, and many parts are simply changed at the same time, so as not to go to the service center again. At the same time, you come across cars with mileage over 250,000, where nothing is changed at all. On older cars, repairs are required more often due to sagging springs, assembly errors, untimely alignment, and wear of shock absorbers. And non-original parts last less. An unpleasant feature of the GLA platform is the weak wheel bearings. They have a service life of 150 to 200,000 kilometers, but fail under any impact, especially from the side. The electric power-assisted rack is quite reliable. There are no knocks like on the A-Class. This is probably due to the higher tire profile. But the service life of the tips also leaves much to be desired. By the time they reach 100,000, they have probably already been replaced. Most of the troubles with the steering wheel are caused by failures of the steering wheel position sensors or flooded Euro connectors. At first glance, everything is good in the transmission, and the CV joints are very successful. But corrosion of the spline joints of the angular drive and the short life of the driveshaft outboard bearing in all-wheel drive versions can throw up an unpleasant surprise. Manual cars are vanishingly rare, although this is an excellent option since there is nothing to break in the transmission. Even the clutch in combination with a gasoline engine is equipped with a conventional flywheel, not a dual-mass flywheel. Hey buddy, looking for a used car? You should pay attention to the site Carmi.pro. Carmi.pro is huge catalog of cars, engines, gearboxes, and the best part is, you can find out about breakdowns of any part of any car, absolutely free. Go on Carmi.pro and be aware of all possible malfunctions. Carmi.pro. There is only one automatic transmission here, but in different versions. This is a pre-selective 7-speed robot of the 724.00X series. On weak versions it is presented in versions 724.001/002, on diesel engines 003/004, on gasoline all-wheel drive vehicles 011/015/016. They differ mainly in gear ratios, differential, and a number of reinforced parts. In fact, this is a branded version of the GLA X156 DCT300. They are similar in layout and design of the main components, but are not interchangeable. They have different housings and control units. The main trouble with the box is that if there are any errors in the mechatronics, the very expensive clutch unit suffers. As a rule, it is not restored and is sold only assembled. A few successful examples of repairs only confirm the rule. The price of the block ranges from 100 to 120,000 rubles. There is no non-original, and no one is trying to install a Valio kit for GLA. It costs about 170,000, and there is simply no point in it. At mileages over 200,000, synchronizers and bearings make themselves known, and when operating on dirty oil, the mechatronics become capricious. There are two filters, and it is better to change the external one often. There are also certain difficulties with cooling. The box gets very hot, and with early firmware all the gaskets and plastic tubes become tanned by 5 years of operation. Naturally, any overheating of the car affects the gearbox. Unfortunately, there is always a risk of errors 071100/079100/274500 appearing on the mechatronics board sensors, which necessitates repairing the board or purchasing a new one. Repairs usually cost around 15,000, and a new board costs 80,000. But if the cause was overheating, the error usually repeats. In all-wheel drive, the angular transmission breaks down and the electrohydraulic clutch jams, resulting in jerking when cornering. In the angular gear, you need to monitor the presence of oil during runs under 100,000 in for backlash. And the clutch heavily contaminates the oil during winter operation, which is why the clutches in the block eventually become damaged. In general, it is better to change the oil once every season or two, especially if you drive your car quickly in the summer. From a technical point of view, the GLA is a rather banal 5-door hatchback on the MF8 platform with all-wheel drive. The proportions of the body differ minimally from what could be seen a little earlier on A-Class hatchbacks, but all external body panels are new. Since an off-road body kit, different bumpers and optics are used. The body itself is reinforced with several crossmembers, and the aerodynamic protection of the underbody is changed. The body is strictly 5-seater and 5-door. The arrangement of the units is in line at the front. The base drive is front-wheel drive, but for the powerful versions of the GLA 250 and GLA 45 AMG, only all-wheel drive is offered. In general, the GLA does not have radical differences from the A-Class, and at first glance the technology is the same, but in operation the difference between the cars is still noticeable. The banal difference in ground clearance and suspension settings makes the GLA a noticeably different car. 154 mm of ground clearance may not be serious, but compared to the A-Class and its 104 mm, the GLA is already much better adapted to life. The steering response may be a little worse than that of a simple hatchback, but at the same time the car reacts more easily to problematic asphalt without shaking the whole body on the rails and potholes. The arches do not suffer from sandblasting, and you also don't have to worry about scratching the low-hanging front bumper. Here it is not painted and does not reach the curbs in height. Well, 5 centimeters of seat height makes it much more comfortable to get into the car without unnecessary acrobatics. It's a pity that the trunk volume is just as small, just over 400 liters, and that's without a spare wheel. If you install the standard 138/80 or 17 tire, the trunk volume will decrease by another good 40 liters. And this is only possible for cars with front-wheel drive. There is no chance for all-wheel drive, there is no spare wheel niche, and the wheel will simply lie in the trunk. Minor chips on the hood, on the leading edge of the roof and doors are not that uncommon, but you will have to literally look for them with a magnifying glass. The car is painted quite well, and the paintwork is holding up well. As a result, the chips are point-like, and the process of their growth with underfilm corrosion occurs rarely. Moreover, the hood and front fenders are made of aluminum. Pay attention to whether the varnish on the roof does not fade and whether it adheres well to the bumpers. For some reason the paint on plastic does not stick better than on metal. There is virtually no chance of finding visible corrosion. The most serious problems encountered were a faded chip at the junction of the front fender and bumper, a rust point on the leading edge of the roof, and strange corrosion on the leading edge of the door, where the paintwork was chipped over a large area. So cars without accidents on the outside should still be almost perfect, unless they were regularly driven on graders. But there are scratches under the door handles. The films on the doors are regretted. They also spared the sealant on the door seams, so when purchasing, inspect them carefully from the inside, as well as the door frames. If you see swollen areas, you can bargain. This problem is not dangerous, but it is difficult to eliminate. The most vulnerable parts of the A-Class on the GLA are covered with plastic. For example, on the edges of the arches the plastic is glued with double-sided tape. As a result, the lockers are attached a little better, and the edge itself is covered. The door openings have quite decent linings at the bottom. The paintwork is scratched only by the most careless owners. Well, the front lower part of the rear door opening often has scuffs, simply due to the ergonomics of sitting in the back row. The legs rest against the door opening. Rubbing from seals and doorways occurs, but usually they do not penetrate through to the metal and do not pose a threat. Inspection of the GLA from below is highly advisable. However, you will still look for leaks in the gearboxes and motor. This is a common problem for OM651, M270, and their transmissions, and at the same time you can carefully inspect the body. Most of the bottom surface is covered with plastic, but the rear parts of the sills and the gas tank niche are visible, and you can also look under the lockers. And with a flashlight and an endoscope, you can get a complete picture of the condition of the car. Unfortunately, many cars already have decent surface corrosion on the bottom, especially in poorly ventilated and unheated areas in the rear of the body. This does not yet pose any special problems, but in the long term it is unpleasant. There are a lot of seams in the arches. They are covered with a rather thin layer of sealant, and after opening the seams it will be difficult to do it like from the factory. Fortunately, a lot depends on the operating conditions, and even in St. Petersburg you can find a car whose bottom is still almost pristinely clean, not counting small spots near the hairpins and chips in the rear at the edges of the sill. If you are buying the GLA for a long time and not to drive for a year, then do not be lazy to check everything. There is a mud niche in the front arch. There are no problems with the body yet because of this, but it needs to be washed. There are no problems of this kind in the rear arches, but the studs for fastening the lockers are extremely unfortunate and serve as centers of corrosion. Most cars don't have problems with moisture in the trunk, but it's also worth checking. The ventilation louvers in the bumper like to fall out of their seat, and moisture from under the arch goes into the trunk. True, in most cases the water manages to reach the rear passenger's feet, while the trunk remains dry. It's also worth checking the left side of the interior floor for moisture. It happens that the tube for the rear washer bursts and floods the interior at the passenger's feet. There are no problems with the seams of the body in the engine compartment, so an inspection of these elements is only necessary to make sure that no emergencies have happened to the car. It would seem that this is a small Mercedes. What problems could there be? Unfortunately, the complexity of modern cars is growing. The saturation of options is also growing, but the reliability of all the numerous mechatronics is not very high. The weak headlights and windshield here are just like on the A-Class. They are sandblasted, and the xenon is also actively burning out. DRLs do not save it. The plastic front panel, in common parlance TV, on delicate aluminum amplifiers is actually quite durable, but it is important that it is assembled well, because it has to be removed for any more or less complex maintenance of the motor. The unfortunate trapezoid of the wipers breaks. It pulls out the hinges of the lever drive on the passenger side. Fortunately, they are now repaired and not replaced as a whole. But the rear wiper gearbox simply jams. Chrome peeling off by the 5th year of operation is a sign of a not very good attitude towards the car. With garage storage and high-quality washes, the problem does not arise so early. The parking sensors are not very well mounted. The fuel filler neck lock remains capricious, and complaints about failures of the keyless entry system due to faulty keys and door handles are becoming increasingly common. And the button to open the trunk door was capricious from the very beginning. Sometimes the side door seals fail. They are torn off from below, and the opening begins to make noise and stain the thresholds. Window seals often fail, they warp and the glass begins to whistle at speed. One of the relatively noticeable troubles remains the problem with the adsorber, as on the A-Class, it becomes clogged and stops passing fuel vapors, which, with the selected tank ventilation scheme, leads to the fact that it is simply impossible to fill more than a third of the volume into it. In general, there are plenty of minor problems, but, to the brand's credit, they do not arise all at once. Much depends on maintenance, and in general, the series of repairs and replacements lasts from runs of about 100 or 1,000 to over 200, when all the small things begin to be changed for the second time. The main problem with the interior is that it is small. Yes, it's downright cramped here, especially in the back row. There's plenty of room in the front, but the driver sits like a hand in a glove. But in the back there is simply not enough legroom, not enough headroom and width if there are 5 people driving. At the same time, everything is simple, ergonomic, and made of quite pleasant materials. Moreover, the GLA does not come in very poor trim levels like the A and B class. Except that buyers sometimes saved money on the multimedia system by abandoning the most expensive and advanced NTG. But for those who do not disdain non-standard devices, there are now Android combines in a standard design and with excellent functionality and integration. Hey buddy, looking for a used car? You should pay attention to the site Carmi.pro. Carmi.pro is huge catalog of cars, engines, gearboxes, and the best part is, you can find out about breakdowns of any part of any car, absolutely free. Go on Carmi.pro and be aware of all possible malfunctions. Carmi.pro. Otherwise, in terms of finishing and its quality, everything is not bad. The appearance of the interior begins to deteriorate only when driven well beyond 200,000 kilometers or with a very heavy driver, 24-hour careless operation, and other extreme cases. The interior does not like dust, but if you do not open the windows and change the cabin filter on time, this is not a problem. The metallization of beautiful aluminum buttons and switches in expensive versions oxidizes a little, but in cheaper versions the plastic wears out minimally. The steering wheel and armrests hardly wear out. The steering wheel loses its texture after about 150,000 miles, and the steering wheel buttons and steering column levers easily acquire their original matte shine with the help of chemicals. The multimedia system does not have very good speakers. Moreover, they wheeze for various reasons, the most unpleasant of which is a rupture of the speaker membrane. This happens quite often, and the original speaker costs inhumanely. However, there is a non-original of decent quality that stands up like a real one. The climate control system is quite reliable, but with mileages exceeding 250,000 kilometers, failures of the air conditioning compressor are becoming more common, and the condenser is a little weak and suffers from pebbles. However, most cars have not yet reached such mileages, and their air conditioning fan begins to howl. Although there are also cases when the motor brushes of this fan wear out and stoppages begin. Just 3 years ago there was almost no mention of widespread problems with the GLA's electrical system, for example, complaints about a couple of control unit connectors. It has now been reliably established that the engine compartment wiring harness is extremely poorly secured and is worn out in several places at once. In some cases, it is enough to preventively remove the fastening bracket and make a couple of turns of insulating tape, but in some cases it is already necessary to change a piece of wiring because the insulation is broken and the wire begins to crumble from the inside. The main problem with the wiring of gasoline engines is behind the air filter, where there is a metal bracket that grabs a plastic tie. Around 2016, the bracket was replaced, and there is no obvious problem with the harness, but it is still worth checking. Other damages occur less frequently, but in any case, it is better to show the car to a specialist in this model for prevention. This is significantly cheaper than changing the wiring harness. Oil in the ECU connector, which gets there due to a leak in the oil pressure sensor, threatens to degrade the plastic over time, but so far this is a minor problem, except that sometimes the pins oxidize. A similar problem with the wiring of the ABS unit also happens. In general, you should ask a diagnostic electrician to check everything before purchasing. There are few difficulties with the generator, there are only rare failures of the overrunning clutch and attempts by the control system to lower the charge voltage, which can be a problem in winter. Fortunately, the second one can be treated with firmware. Also, keep in mind that the car has 2 batteries. The second is installed in the passenger's feet. It's a small lead battery, like in uninterruptible power supplies, and they just started to fail en masse. If you see an error in charging the backup battery, then it applies specifically to it, and not to the main one. The rear view camera is a consumable in humid regions. The top NTG multimedia system is capricious, and the parking sensors are already buggy on 5-year-old cars due to sensors and connectors under the bumpers. Switching units, also known as SAM onboard network hubs, which control almost all executive electrical elements from headlights to the fuel pump in the tank, are capricious. They do not like overloads, lighting, and water. In general, the car is far from ideal in terms of electrical stability. But with proper maintenance, it does not cause any particular problems. Oh, and one more tip, don't lose your car keys. To register them again is a whole story, and in the current conditions it often involves taking the car to Kazakhstan.